Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I've got a little treat for you. I've got a subscriber that wants to share his encounter with us. Before we get into that, a couple links. As you know, I rely on my Patreon, my PayPal, and my merch to help this channel to continue to grow and go. All of those links are in the description below. I also have a second channel for creepypasta, fanfiction, and scary voice acting. Stories that really don't fit on this channel. Now, if that's anything you're into, follow that link and give those stories a listen. You may just like what you hear. Now I've taken enough of your time. Let's get on with today's upload. Shall we? Alright everybody, I'm going to do something a little different today. I've got a subscriber with me on the phone, and he has shared his encounter with me and you guys a couple weeks back. He and I have become friends, chat via email, every once in a while talk on the phone. I thought it'd be a good idea for him to share his story with you guys. Also, he shared a encounter that he had heard from someone that he had met just recently. So everyone, I'm going to introduce you to Jay. Jay, how are you?
I'm pretty good this evening, Jeff. Thank you.
All right. Now, would you? Jay has two encounters. We're gonna get into. We're gonna cover his two, and then he's gonna share with us what he heard from a flea market salesman. And when he told me this encounter, I was absolutely blown away. So, Jay, the floor is all yours if you want to start with your two encounters, and then we'll go from there.
Rightio. Well, Jeff, I'm down here in Southern Virginia, and we have a lot of mountains down here and coal mining heritage and a lot of agriculture and stuff. And I was the youngest out of three children, and my other brother and sister were older than me, and I had nobody to play with. So, I usually ran the mountains and forests and the ponds and the creeks and the streams and taught myself how to hunt and how to naturally love the outdoors. Well, I started growing up, with my first pellet gun, my BB gun, then I graduated to a pellet rifle and on up to a 410 and a yada, 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 and so on and so forth. I've hunted and chased about everything on 4 and 2 legs and feathers in this state. And I come to grow and think myself as a Superman. There wasn't nothing that I couldn't see or stop or encounter. I had no fear of the woods, to the point that I'd walk up in there barefooted with shorts and a shirt on, not afraid of anything. I started deer hunting at an early age, and I hunted them mountains and knew them like the back of my hand. And I thought I'd seen and done everything come to know, and there was nothing in there that I did not know of existed or was no tougher than I was. And if it was tougher than I was, I had my old trusty deer rifle, and I bought my first bolt action, a 300 Magnum that it could handle. Well, I'd hunted all my life, and then up on the family farm, and I was deer hunting. And I thought I was invincible up to that point. Until the year of 1999, I was up in the woods hunting, and it was no day. And all the other particular farms around us, we had no state or local land. We was all surrounded by other private farms. So I was hunting way down on the backside of the mountain. And I was hunting, and I seen a couple few does, and then this buck came around. Well, I shot him and put him down. Well, as I went down there to get him, that's where I figured where he was at. I seen him, watched him fall. I went down there to start dressing him and field dressing him and start dragging him up the mountain. Well, when I got down there, before then, I heard something go up around the top of the ridge, moving faster than I never heard. And I thought it was maybe deer, but deer couldn't even move this fast, and it made so much noise. If anyone's been in the woods, they know what a herd of crackling turkey sounds like when they're scratching for winter food to build the reserves up. I've never heard nothing that noisy move that fast. Well, after it passed, I didn't think no more about it. And I started to begin to mobilize my harvest, and I heard something. I call it a shriek. I'd never heard hell was going on. I thought I'd heard and experienced every sound in the woods, but evidently I hadn't. And I stood there and watched for a while and listened, and I didn't hear it no more, so I started to move a little more. And then I started hearing the brush move. And I kept hearing and trying to stabilize where it was coming from. So, I got the deer somewhat up the mountain. And then all of a sudden, I heard this, like somebody hit an air valve. I don't know. It was never heard nothing like that before. Like a deep breath, I guess you would say, times 10. I've known something I never heard. I can imagine the lung power on this thing. I didn't know what was going on. And then I watched where it was coming from and hearing the stuff breaking. It was loud. Then I started making out a shape coming through the laurel and the ivy. But it never got clear enough for me to see. Well, I was sitting there watching it, and I didn't know what to do. And finally, I put the scope on it and was watching it, trying to get it open and find out what this was. And I noticed this thing was not 2 or 3 foot tall. It was bigger than that. I mean, it stood, what I could tell, I could see a shadow 5 to 6 plus feet tall. And finally, I was getting scared to death, because I'd done decided by this time this is no man. And finally, when I got a sight I got an opening through the laurel and the ivy, a little patch. All I could see was the end of part of a snout and an ear sticking up, and I could make out brown patches and brownish red sort of on the body. I mean, it wasn't exactly red, it was like a dark brown and almost black where it was so dark. And I had the scope on without once a bottle where I seen a snout, and I knew this was nothing I'd ever encountered. And what I could see was part of the nose, some of the snout, some of the head and the ears and patches on the body. I put the scope, of course, what I thought knew was the head. Well, all of a sudden, like I said, I heard that sound again, like a deep wheeze. And then it howled. I had never heard a howl like this before. I've experienced coyotes all my life, hound dogs, I've heard bobcats, and even some cougars we suspect cry at night, but I've never heard nothing like this in the daytime. So you can imagine it's like your whole world crashes. You're no longer the number one predator in the woods. I mean, it's like taking everything you've ever known and just shoving it out the door, and you're beginning from scratch again with a pen and a paper. And I was frozen. Not just frozen, but scared. I was scared and curious at the same time. When this happened, I automatically dropped the rope on the deer and started watching it, and I started backpedaling very slowly, keeping my back up to the fence line, watching this thing and moving. And then when I got about 25 to 30 yards from it and it got more covered up in brush, I hauled freight. And I crossed the fence on the borderline and met up with my buddy at the top of the mountain. He was hunting on out the ridge. When he come out there, he could tell that I was really, really tore up. He's never seen me like that. I was white, shaking, clammy, and sweaty. And I told him. But before I could tell him, he asked what that sound was. He heard the howl as well as I did. And we come on out, and after I explained things for about 15, 20 minutes, we sat there and talked, and he helped me calm down and stuff. Well, we went down there, and we discussed what we were going to do, what we were going to try to do, trying to figure this out, how to get the kill out of the woods. Where I was raised and the way we were taught, you don't leave a downed animal in the woods if you have any at all way of retrieving it. It's against nature and it's against everything else we believe in. Well, we decided that his father and my stepfather would go back with us, and we would try to reclaim if it was there, or at least try to figure out what was going on. And, well, I traded my rifle in for a pump shotgun that I had, and the rest of them carried their rifles. And we all went up there, and there was 4 of us. We drove up the mountain. We spent the fence line. We all got together, got our gear and stuff, and we all crossed the fence and we went out there slowly, nose to back to tail, one in the front, 2 in the middle, 1 in the back, keeping watch. And it took us, I know, probably 45 minutes to move 200 yards because we was moving very slowly, watching and looking for everything. The whole time, the 2 older men, of course, being older and one of the younger men don't know what we're talking about. They're doubting what I've seen, heard, and what my other buddy had heard, trying to make poke fun at us. Well, when we get out there, we find the deer, we find the animals. And there was nothing changed about it. It was exactly where I'd left. The only difference is it had been drugged up and and out the hill just a little bit, like around in a circle. And there was all kinds of brush and leaves and litter that had been turned up. It looked like somebody had took a weedy or a leaf blower and just blew all the way around the keel. And you could tell it looked like it just had been played with, maybe drugged a little bit and sniffed. Well, we didn't think nothing of it, and we grabbed it and we started dragging. And we took turns, my buddy would drag a while and then I'd drag a while, and we kept somebody in the middle with the deer, one on the front on point and one in the back watching. Well, we finally got it up to the top of the mountain, and me and my stepdad had switched out. And there's a big tree right there at the border fence where you cross over. It's an old poplar, I think. And been there all our lives. And everybody knew the tree because you walk right by it and you see it. We used to call it the T tree because it was shaped like a T and bent when I guess they were dealing with a sap when I grew that way. And there was no marks on this tree at all. And here we go. We get within 20 yards of the fence line. The older two men, the gents that know better, I think they know it all, start poking fun at me and him. Call me, say, I don't know what I've seen. I heard this rabid squirrel that jumped out of the tree and was hollering and thought it was this and that and yada, yada, yada. I think just poking fun like normally older men would, I guess, not to experience what we did. And right when we got right to that tree, get ready to cross over the border fence, I looked up, and right there was 4 slashes coming straight down that tree about, I would say, 7.5 foot up. I mean, they looked like they was a quarter of an inch deep, and you could tell the bark was fresh because this was not done that morning, and it was not done when we re-entered the woods to retrieve my kill. And you could see the layer away from the tree. You could see the sap had been pulled back, and it was actually dripping down the tree. And whatever had made this was no bear. The older men try to do it, and they try to make excuses. Well, we all know the difference that a black bear usually don't stand that tall and reach up like this. And you could tell between the width of the cut in between, this was no bear. And the 2 older gents actually lost their breath. They didn't know what to think. And I think at that day they become a believer, or at least maybe a little bit of a doubter instead of much of a skeptic. And then something had done it, and it was not there when we went in, and it was there when we came back out. And we got to retrieve my kill in the harvest and got it loaded up and took back out of the mountain. And I got an education that day. And I've took it up since, and I've been studying them ever since, trying to figure out what that was. And the only thing I could come close, at that time, I didn't know the extension of the word Dogman. And I've done after all kinds of research. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was a name that was around, but it wasn't fluid. So they called it a walking wolf or a buffalo wolf. That's what a lot of people said it was. So that's when I started calling it. We just decided it was a buffalo wolf. Well, I have hunted and continued on since then. And, I got a little smarter, a little bit more educated. And from that time on, I never experienced it no more.
Jay, I don't mean to cut you off real quick. I just got a question to ask you. When you guys were going by the tree and the old guys saw that tree, were they still using the excuse bear?
They thought of it. One of them mentioned bear until the tallest one, which is me. I stand around 6'2".
Right.
And the other one said, reach up there. I reached up there, and I could reach it, but, I had to stand on my tippy toes, and my ring finger, my index finger, barely come to the end of one of the cuts. Now, that's how tall it was.
Yeah.
And they knew good and well that a bear is not going to be up there in that amount of time during deer season with all these rifles running around. It's not going to stop to mark its territory.
A black bear's paw isn't that big either. They're big, but they're not huge, they're...
No, they're not huge. They're wider than they are tall.
Right.
And they come to the equivalent that maybe I did see something and hear something. And they shut them up real quick. But at the same time, they were guessing. And I told them what all I'd seen and what I had experienced out there, and they had come to the conclusion it was no bear.
Right. All right. I didn't mean to cut you off. I kind of wanted to jump in there, and because I was curious of what those guys were thinking because they were busting your hump on it.
well, we have to clarify it for the people. And I mean, it's the more people know, the better off they are. These things are real. They exist in every state in the union and beyond. It's hard to tell. These have been here probably for millennia.
Yep.
We can specify. We can guess at what their lineage is, where they come from, or how long we've been here, or if they're a government experiment. The truth is, we will never know.
Your second encounter, that one, there's a funny part because your friend busted your ass on it, but until he saw it, you want to share that second one with us?
Yeah, I told one of my best friends. He's still currently my best friend today. We've been friends for, I guess I'd say 26 years. And I worked the place. We worked together, and we kind of grew up and become men together and married and had families. And I told him the experience. Of course, he's going to poke fun. He's just about 3 or 4 years younger than me, and he started boasting the fun. There's an old fable called Russian fable, an Eastern European Russian fable called Sasha, the boy who cried wolf. And I'm sure probably most of the people in your audience at one time or another has heard it or seen the remake of the Walt Disney classic, The Fable and the Cartoon.
Yep.
And that's what he started calling me, Sasha, the boy who thought he seen but didn't and cried wolf. I had to listen to that all my life and still listen to it. And, Daniel was the same way until we had our experience I think it was about 4.5 or 5 years later. And we hunted together. We did that everything together. We hunted, we fished, we hiked, talked, we done it all. And we were small game hunting up on a farm. I think it was about 4 or 5 years later.
Same farm?
And the same farm, same family farm, same place.
Okay.
We start hunting around down here around September when squirrel season comes in, and that's about the only small game you can legally hunt. And we love squirrel gravy down here. And if anybody else has never tasted it, it's a southern delicacy. I mean, if you ever taste it, you would remember it for the rest of your life. Well, we started hunting every year to try to get enough for at least we try to get together every once in a while. We'd have a big fry and cook them up, and our wives would fix biscuits and squirrel gravy. Well, we were trying hunting to get enough. Well, when we started, the first couple of days was normal. We seen 1 or 2 and maybe heard another one. But as time went on, weekend by weekend, week by week, we noticed less and less. And not only just that, the woods had quietened down. I would say 60-70%. You'd always hear, the ground squirrels, chipmunks cheering and chattering, birds flying and hollering. You'd hear turkeys out on the ridge, cackle every once in a while. Occasionally see a fox come by or coyote or all that good stuff. Even trampled deer. The farm used to be full of deer. I mean, it still is to a certain extent, but at that time, everything had been cut in 3/4. We couldn't understand it, and by the first week, we looked up and went, well, it'll improve. By the second week, we were guessing. We didn't know what was going on. We were trying to make heads or tails of what was causing this. Well, as time went on, we were figuring a plan. I thought, well, we'll try one more week. By the third week, we had discussed it and come to the point that we had skepticized that there was a pack of coyotes on out the ridge there and all up on the farm, and they had been making trouble for the local ranchers, for sheep and stuff and chicken and people who raise hogs. And we figured, maybe, I guess, giving up during the night, they'll go and try to fetch farmer during the day. They had trampled and either ran out of all the wildlife because of the amount of them, the way they travel, or just to eat and rub them off. I mean, that's all we had come to the conclusion, I didn't think nothing else could do something like that. And him still non-believer as usual. Sasha this and Sasha that. Oh, Sasha, you don't know nothing. So I wouldn't throw in my idea of what I possibly thought it could have been. Of course, I didn't want to hear no more ridicule than I had to, but the thought was always in the back of my mind. Again, what if? And just in case it was what if, I had no idea and no wish to ever come across or see this thing again. Once you experience it, you'll know. You don't want to have nothing to do with it. You don't want to see them. You don't want to hear about them. I'll study them and find out as much of the species I can or what I can about it. Being a cryptid, all we can do is guess. It's not a science. It's not a specific science. we're just making ideas and theories together to try to find out what this is and what's causing it. So I didn't mention it to him no more. I didn't want to be made fun of. But at the same time, I thought, oh no, maybe yes. Well, by the third weekend, we'd made plans to set up with a wildlife caller and with some rabbit squeals and other stuff to try to get the coyotes in, and maybe thin out the population. And hopefully maybe that would take care of a lot of it. Well, we'd made the plans and set up, and the end of that week, I was meeting him. Well, I called, and we made plans to meet up in the meeting area up in toward probably about 20 minutes from the farm. It was in between his house and mine. And I drove in and met him, and he flung the door open as he put his gear in the back, and all I could hear, "What's up, Stasha?" And I'm like, well, blah, 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 FU. Sorry, subscribers. I don't want to use that kind of language, though. I do sometimes. And I had to listen to his mouth, and I'm just thinking, all right, whatever, big boy. Well, he threw his gear in the back, and we already had the stereo and the speakers, and we were dressed in camouflage with our sidearms and everything else we had needed. And I think we left there about 7. Well, we got up to the farm about just a few minutes after 7 and began setting up. And by this time, it's getting good and dark. The time has not changed by this time, but we're right on the edge of it. It gets dark about 7:30 by this time. And we got our place. We set up. We split the loudspeakers up on the fence line because they were electronic. There's no wires. Everything was battery powered. And we had the master switch, and we set everything up and got our spot, got our glasses, our flashlight, our spotlight ready, and made sure all our weapons were loaded and stuff in case. I had a 260 Remington Savage. My buddy had a 444 Darwin. He called it Old Painless. I think that rifle was probably the hardest kicking rifle I've ever shot in my life. It was an old Darwin, and his nickname was Painless. And anyway, that was his favorite. Well, we got set up, and pardon expression, I was scared as hell because I was very timid. I had a feeling that something was going to maybe possibly show itself, or I would see something or experience something that I never ever want to come in contact again with in my life. I just had that feeling. I don't know if it was a reoccurring feeling from the previous experience being scared, or it was just something in the air emitting. But when we got up there was something different. I could tell. There was nothing calling, nothing moving. The wind was steady. There was no sound up in the woods. I mean, and when it's like that, with no wind up there, I mean, you can hear for hundreds of yards up at the mountain. If a tree limb breaks or even a stick is stepped on and cracked from 300 yards away up in the mountain, though you might see, you can hear it. But I thought, it was just a little too still. There was something wasn't right. Well, about 7:35, somewhere around 7:40, he started calling. And after a few minutes, nothing had happened. I mean, I had a red filter on the spotlight that I put over the white light, the regular light is what they call it, the white light, that actually supposedly keeps critters and varmints from actually spotting you and seeing you. It don't scare them, it don't excite them and run them off. Every few minutes, every 7-10 minutes, he would stop calling, and I'd hit the light, and I'd take it around the farmland, the pasture, on the hillside and the edge of the woods. Nothing. Well, after an hour, we were ready to leave. We didn't know what was going on. There was no sound, no coyotes. It was just so still you wouldn't believe it. And all of a sudden, we heard something coming down the fence line, just a busting raw tail. And it was moving fast. And we might have thought it was a deer, so that's what I thought it was. Well, it made so much racket the way it ran. Finally, when it busted the fence line, we seen the eye shine. And it come on down through and run right out to the right of the pasture and kept on going and hit the creek and disappeared as a raccoon. But I'd never seen a raccoon move like this. I mean, it was like it had a nest of bees attached to its hind end. Never, ever seen one move like that. And we were getting to guessing, well, what in the world, would a coon be running from? A coon is on its own, is one-on-one. I've known of hounds that these things have drowned in water. I mean, a coon is on its back. When you find a dog fight in its territory, a coon is a very dangerous animal. I mean, when it's cornered, it can tear you up, even a human. And I've never seen one afraid like that. I've never seen one be afraid of anything, really. I mean, And especially to move this fast, that far, that quick. I didn't know what was going on. And neither did Daniel. And we were sitting there, and then just a few minutes later, we started hearing something. And it was moving quick. And I mean, it was breaking brush and moving leaves and leaf litter, and it sounded like it was snapping trees. It sounded like an upside-down bulldozer rolling down through the woods, but with speed and authority. And I'm like, and Daniel's like, what in the hell is that? And I said, I have no idea. But I knew probably pretty much what was getting ready to happen. And it was coming on down the ridge, following the border fence line down toward the pasture and into the meadows where it comes out and you can see. Well, it stopped for a few minutes. And then all of a sudden we heard the barbed wire on top of the border fence stretch. And you could hear a real squeak. And you can hear it for hundreds of yards, when there's no wind and no sound. And he looked at me and I looked at him, and he's like, what in the hell can do that? And I told him, the only thing I know with that much weight that could possibly cross the fence would be a bear. Other than that, and that's if a bear can do it, I don't know. Well, we heard this. All of a sudden, it come on down there real quick, and then I heard that it stopped, and I started hearing that moan. It was almost like a howl, but not exactly like a howl. Like it almost sounded like somebody choking as they pull in a deep breath, and it's so powerful. It'll shake you. It actually shakes a human body. And this was at least a couple hundred yards away by this time. Well, it came on down and was getting closer, but it had slowed down. And by this time, I had been pulling the red filter off the spotlight to get the white light so we could see clearer. And all of a sudden, as it come around the ridge out into the open, I started seeing a set of eyes bobbing 3 to 4 foot up and down. It was going up and down, vertical, side to side, and it would go from maybe 3 foot down close to the ground up to about 5.5 to 6 foot. And the eyes were, it's hard to explain when you see these eyes. It looks like a dirty beer glass with light shine through it. I mean, it's gold, it's yellow, it's not exactly orange, but it's not red. It's the color all its own. And we seen this, the spotlight shows off the side before the main beam. And I'd say within 15 feet before the main beam, just the lower light to the side, you could see these things reflecting, like reflectors off a bicycle. And I knew right then and there what it was. And Daniel had frozen. He's like, what in God's name is that? I said, oh, well, big boy, you're getting ready to get an experience. And he's like, is that what you seen? I said, I have no idea. Well, when it come on down, and we got a little bit closer, a little clearer, it come on down to about 150 yards. And it started moving walking real slow. By this time, we could see it pretty much. It was at the edge of the field, still in the pasture, still covered up by saplings and trees, but for the most part, we could see it as best we could. Most I'd ever seen of it, and the most I ever want to see ever again. And you could tell that this thing was not exactly Schwarzenegger style, but it was cut. I mean, even at that distance, you could see it wasn't very big as far as body mass. We estimated it probably 190, 220 pounds, but it was real tight and real cut. And it was shaped sort of like what we call a wasp. I mean, it was cut up top, and it come up, we could see, and it had almost like a man's chest, but not as much hair from what we could see. And it come on down with this little old bitty waist, and it was odd. It looked like when the old days when they put a corset on you and tied in real tight, during the days of Civil War, and pull your gut in. And that's exactly the way we imagined, in a cartoon this thing looked, but that's what it looked like. It had the wasp-shaped body come on down to a little bitty waist and then down into the legs. And where I could see the legs, they were inverted. They were turned backwards just like a dog. And I knew what it was. And Daniel was just sitting there in awe. But he was scared. I could see the beads of sweat dancing a diggy on his head and dropping off. Well, I heard that hammer talking back, and I thought, oh no. Well, this animal hears it too. And it comes on down, so it moves a little bit, and it moved real quick, real fast to come on out to, I think it was its right, our left, and then it stopped again. By this time, we could see it, the majority of it from the edge of the woods still be covered up by green briars and some laurel pretty much, but for the most part, we could see it. They had stepped out into the edge of the pasture. goes and puts the gun to his eye. And he starts watching it. And I see that trigger finger gets an inch tighter and tighter. I can see the muscle, the tendons in his finger get tight. About the time he pulls the trigger, I put my finger from my right hand across the hammer, and I said, don't. I said, if there's no reason to, let's not start something that possibly we can't finish. And his old gun, he said, oh, painless, and put it down. I said, you have no idea what this is, and neither do I. He's like, well, is that what you've seen? I said, yeah, for the most part, that's it. I said, I don't want a part of it. Let's not start something we possibly can't finish. And I had my rifle bolted and ready to go just in case, and I had my 357 Magnum sidearm, and he had his 10 millimeter just in case. But it come on down, and it stopped dead on and was looking at us. And it was, you could tell by the way the eyes would just sit there, it was focused on us. And at one time, after a few seconds, it looked like Daniel was entranced. I mean, he was not moving. His mouth was hung open. He was sitting there watching into it. And then finally, I reached over and tapped him on the shoulder, and he come back too. By this time, he didn't listen to nothing I said. He pulled that gun up, and I'm like, what are you doing? And he shot about 4 to 5 feet in front of that thing, right at the edge of the pasture, where the hardwood soil come out to the soft soil that had been there in the summer from the rain and the hay and everything else, and the cattle, and it was soft. When that big bullet hit that ground, you could see the hole that it made and hooved up ground, dirt, and pasture and grass and everything. And it must have shrapneled that daggone thing, because it jumped straight up 3 or 4 feet, and it took off the running, and it took back up the way it went, and about the time it stopped again and turned around. It ran back up to the edge of the mountain the way it came. And instead of cutting right back up the mountain, it stopped at the border fence right on the edge of the woods, and it turned around and we got one last look at it. And then it howled. I mean, it howled. It wasn't a loud howl, but it was a moan and just a straight howl into something that horror movies cannot even get right from the get-go. And the appearance of this did not even scare him as much. The sound was what got him. And then it takes off running, and we can hear it clean up the mountain. And after it does, we look at each other and we're like, what in the clock was that? And I looked over at him and I told him, well, since I'm Sasha and there's Little Red Riding Hood with the hood, you're the beast in the hood now. And he started laughing. I'm trying to inject levity in the situation that we were both scared to death and experience something that most want in their life and most don't want. And to the people out there that want to experience this, you think you do. Once you see it, you don't. Right. You cannot erase it from your mind. And we started gathering up our equipment. We was both so scared, we just grabbed our guns, and the seats we were sitting on, the loudspeaker, or the loud sounder itself, and left the speakers for the next day. We threw everything in the truck and hauled straight off the mountain. And that was our second encounter, and my last up till date that I've ever seen one.
Right, and then, like I've said multiple times, once someone has an encounter, there's a couple of things. They either just forget about it, shut down, or they become super engrossed and want to know more and read everything or learn as much as they can, and that's what you have chosen to do. There's just multiple ways of dealing with having an encounter. The majority of the people that I've talked to are like you and I. They want to learn as much as they can about these things. And unfortunately, there are a few people that have actually, I've heard, commit suicide, coped with it through drug addiction and alcoholism. It's a very traumatic experience for people, and it's crazy, which leads me to the encounter that actually got me thinking about having you on the show, because this actually had a complete negative effect on a person you met that had, this family farm it was in their family for years, I guess, that you said, and they ended up getting rid of it. Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, sure. This was just recently here Monday. We had at the Memorial Day flea market we have down here every year. It's a big gathering, as big as it can be, considering this COVID-19 crisis going on, if you want to call it that. I went up there with my friend and my neighbor, and we were going up there looking for whatever buys we could. I'm a knife and gun man and antique man, so I'm going up there just trying to see if I can find anything. And I come across this man who's got a couple swords and some knives out, and I get talking to him, and he said he had some guns for sale, and I looked over, and he had the van back there in the back, and he had the door open, and the guns were strung out on a sheet and a blanket, and he said, you can go back there and look, and I got some ammo. Well, I went back there. He didn't have nothing really that I wanted, and I looked through the ammo and found a box of 32 automatic, which is a decent cartridge. It's hard to come by. It's common, but not as common as most would be. You usually got a special order. Well, I bought the ammo off of it. And we got talking, and first thing after I purchased them, he said, do you hunt? I said, oh, yeah, I hunt. I hunt every year as much as I can. And he said, I used to hunt. He said, I used to have a lot of it on my family farm. And he told me he was from Enrico County, Virginia, and he had used to have a lot of wildlife and, animals out there on his farm, and they used to raise animals for processing, and most of it was sheep. Wool, and they process sheep. You think he said it was third generation had been in the family that long. And him and his brother inherited after, his last parent had passed away, and him and his wife had moved into the family farm, the house that's set up on it. I think it's 376 acres. Anyway, it's just him and his brother. And the father said before he passed away that he would leave it to him and his brother if they promised never to sell it and keep it in the family, take care of it. Well, they agreed, and he left it to them. And, a couple of years, I think he still went by after they passed. And they never had trouble with nothing. A few coyotes here and there, but nothing ever really home to mother about it, he said. And he went out one morning, and one of his sheep was missing. And, he said he had a 4.5-foot high-tensile wire fence around the border pasture that kept the sheep in the pasture, and 2 strands of barbed wire on top of that. And he got to looking, and he walked all the way around the fence and was trying to find it. Well, he found a spot on top where the wire had been pushed down, and there was some wool stuck in it. And he got to thinking, well, if somebody would have stole it, or an animal would have got it, they would have tried to drag it under the fence or eat it and tear it up right here in the pasture. He didn't think nothing of it. He told me that he thought maybe one of the neighbors down the road, none of a very good domestic type of people, might have come by one night, and then a couple of them got drunk and high and went and stole one. That's what he had thought. Because he'd looked for it and never did find it. He didn't think nothing of it. A few days later, 2 of them disappeared. And he said it really started bothering this time. So he hollered at him and his brother, and they brought the 4-wheelers over there and escorted around the pasture. Well, they had 2 dogs with them. The dogs they had raised, one was 8.5, and I think the other one was 6. And they always rode on the back of the 4-wheeler when they went to farm. And these were the ones that herded up the sheep and kept the goats in the farm and run off any kind of predator or anything, and kept the cows herded up when they herd them. I mean, I reckon the way he explained they were well trained. So they start riding the 4-wheelers out on the trail around the fence line, and they start following. The dogs are on it. Well, till they get to the corner of the hill where it turns around up above the water hole, he said, going up into the forest, the dogs just automatically tucked their tail between their legs and took off running back to the house. And he said him and his brother stopped, and, it was like, WTF. This had never happened in all the years of these animals that they'd had them. And, he said these were registered animals that were highly trained. They couldn't figure out, what was going on. He said they didn't whimper just a couple times, but they took the 12-finger legs and run. Well, they didn't think nothing of it. They went up on the mountain, and they were tracking. And they found a piece of wool here, a piece of wool there, a little bit of blood. So I think he said he got about halfway up through there, and they found the rear hind corners of one of them. And he said it looked like the thing had been broken clean in half and twisted at the spine, right up at the edge of the hips. And he said there was nothing left of it. He said the meat was eaten down to the bone, from the back of the backbone, the ham on both sides, all the way down to the hoof. He said there's a little bit of wool around just right above the hooves that was left, and the tail was left. That was it. And they couldn't. By this time, he said they're getting scared. He don't know what's going on. He was trying. He said 1,000 things went through his head. And after that, they went on up. They couldn't find the rest of it. And he said they were about ready to turn around and come back. And he said they turned the floors off and was talking. And they heard ravens and crows holler. And they looked up the ridge, and they seen a bunch of birds up there in a big old tree. He said, well, they got on the four-wheeler, their ATVs, and rode on up through there. And so they couldn't figure out what's going on, and they started walking around the tree. Well, on the far back side of the tree, he said they spotted one of the lamb's head hanging over. Evidently, this thing, whatever he had done, it had wedged what was left of the upper half, whether it was a first or second one, they didn't know. In the tree, he said about 14 and a half to 15 and a half foot. And he said all he could see was its head hanging over, its tongue hanging over the far side of the limb. But he said he could see where something had clawed it up under the neck. He has been around the jugular all the way up the left-hand side of the face and over the eyes and back on the nose. 4 big cuts all the way down to the bone. He could see the bone. And he had heard the stories. He said they discuss it out there like at breakfast. It's common. They'll discuss it out there like they would be what's going on in the Wall Street Journal if you're an investor. He said it's an everyday talk among farms out there.
Dogman?
Back here.
They talk about the Dogman right like that, like it's nobody's business, right?
Exactly. Well, first off, I started making excuses. I'm like, I didn't want to let on that I know anything. I don't push this on anybody because a lot of people around here, they don't want to hear it. They think you're crazy and start calling you names. And I started saying, well, there's cougars in Virginia. They speculated and caught it on video. And he said, son, do you think I've been talking about a cat this whole time? I said, well, maybe a pair, I don't know what I'm thinking. I don't want to insult somebody. This man's 6'5" and 375 pounds plus. He looks like a West Virginia hole farm. He's a big old man, real nice guy.
Right.
And what you don't want to pay off if you get my drift. And I said, well, maybe a bear. He said, this was no bear. And he said, have you ever heard a dog? And I said, man. He said, dog, and I said, man, right at the time. He said, dog. I said, yeah, I'm aware of fluent with Dogman. He said, that's what that is. That's what it was. He said, it's a common word out here. We have never had any experience with it before. But he said, it's common out there for them to refer to it. They call them walking dogs out there, he said. Not dog men, but walking dogs. Walking wild dogs. Well, they had discussed it and went on down, and they said they didn't know what to do, so they went back to the house and was making plans. And he said about 2 weeks had passed, and they would go out right before the edge of dark, lock up all the animals, do the best they could to tighten down the latches, that you would say, batten down the hatches and make do for what they could. They said they put up motion lights around what they could and run wire to them, and they would come out right at the edge of dawn and right at the edge of dark and walk around the pasture, both of them, with light and high-powered rifles. Well, one evening, he said about, I think 2 weeks had passed and they had nothing else. They thought maybe it was over. And he said he's seen 2 black figures coming down the fence line, he said about 200 and some yards away. And he said, at that distance, they're walking off fours. He said they're huge. He said by looking at them, they just look like a normal, what you would call a wolf, a dark, blackish brown wolf. He said, but what gives them away is the size. He said they're huge. He said after that, I mentioned to him, I've studied them a while. I've heard them called buffalo wool. And he said that's exactly where the name comes from. It represents them because they look like a small buffalo at that distance. Well, he said he waited on them to get on down closer, and he started firing at them. He shot at them. And he said they took off running. And they never had nothing else, that let them off the night. They didn't experience nothing. I think he said about 3 nights had passed, and evidently he was a little late going out, about 20 minutes later than he normally had. And when he went out there, he said it was almost completely dark. And he said he heard something bust out of the back side of the barn, and looking out there, and they had sheep. They had 1 sheep they had killed, and was walking upright. He knew right then and there. He said he was stunned to see it, but at the same time, he was old enough to know that he seen an animal, one of his, and he was so mad that sent him out of it. and he picked up and he fired at him. He said he fired 2 shots. And if anybody's ever shot a rifle, you can tell by the report of the rifle, most of the time whether you miss by the sound. You can hear it bouncing and echoing off the trees or the rocks or the hollers or whatever. First shot did that. And he said the second shot made the crack, but the sound did not bounce off the rest of the mountain like a regular report of the rifle would. And he thought he might have heard a whimper when he hit it. Well, when it went on out of sight around the ridge, he said he started hearing a bunch of whimpering and whooping like a daggone coyote did. He said they were hollering. He said he figured he'd hit one. And, he thought maybe that would do it. Well, nothing come of it that rest of that night. He thought maybe, he said he was singing a song in the dance. He said, maybe I won, maybe this will do it. Well, the other night had passed and nothing had happened thus far. And he said what he had done, they had young calves that were birthing, and they started putting them in the barn, locking them up inside a pen, and then you lock the doors outside the barn with a lock and a half. He said what him and his brother had done was put an electric wire perimeter fence, 2 strands of it, inside the barn, all the way around the inside, and hook it to the doors. He said they had a side door they could go out and lock and back like a regular door. And he said they would hook it up in the evenings and go up the side door, lock it, and go around the front of the 2 big doors and put a lock and a half, and go in the out there to the tool shed and the pump house, and with the main switch, they would turn the electric fence on out there at night. Well, he said that night after supper, his wife was doing dishes. And he said she looked out the window, and right there was one eyeball to eyeball with her looking in the window. He said the eyes were just glowing, bouncing the light of the wind from the kitchen, went light bouncing through the window, magnifying it. And he said his wife almost had a heart attack, dropped the dish screen and everything. And he said that his wife looked at him and said, I can't take no more. This done it. And he said he was trying to talk her down out of it. Anyway, he's trying to work with her. Well, then all of a sudden, he said they heard a howl. And then it would come to another howl. And he said that time, he called his brother, and his brother locked down everything in his house, and he went around locking all the windows, pulling the shades, pulling the curtains, locking all the doors, double-checking everything, and grabbing guns and firearms and making sure they were loaded and looking out. Well, he said then it started. You could hear them running around the house and hollering. And he said they were whipping and hipping and yipping like coyote, but he said it was a little different than the way they sounded. He said it was just a lot deeper. And then he said he started hearing scratching and cut. And he said his wife couldn't stand it. She was crying. And he bucked up, put all 4 of his high-powered weapons beside of him at the top of the stairs. And he waited there just in case. And he said it just happened most of the night. And he even heard his door. He said he's seen the door hinge actually move. So for anybody out there who's heard the stories that they can open a door, evidently they can. And he said it about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, he fell asleep at the top of the stairs. And he said when he woke up, the birds were, hollering, the sun coming through woke him up. He said when he went down to inspect, he said he looked out all the windows to make sure with the sun up it was clear. When he undone the door and went out, started looking, first thing he noticed, he said he seen the door to the pump house where the unit was that cut on the electric fence was hanging off by 1 hinge. Well, he got to thinking, looking around, as he looked around through the pasture, the junction box that controlled the flow of electricity into the barn was ripped off the wall, out of its stage, and flung about 30 or 35 feet out into the pasture. And he said if that wasn't bad enough, the 2 front doors of the big barn reopened up, a lock and half had been tore off, and he said it looked like a mutant had grabbed a hold of the half and twisted it 2 or 3 times, looked like it turned into a drill bit. And he said when he went in there, he said the newborn calf was gone, but the gate that had it locked up in a pen had not been undone, because he said it had a lock and bolt style like what you'd see on a bolt action or an indoor door lock at the top. He said, but there was blood all the way top the inside of the gate, coming up that side, across the top, and a trail of it all the way out. And he said he inspected that. He got his brother over there. They were making heads and turns of it. And then he said he noticed something around the house. A piece of the sign was hanging loose. And he walked around the side of the house. They said they just had it re-sided a couple of years before his father had passed away. And he said 2 whole pieces of the siding were hanging off. And he said there was claw marks all the way around that side. It looked like something had just put utility knives a half-inch deep and went back and forth down the daggone house. And he said he'd had enough. He said he had to do something. Well, and they said they was going to sell it. His brothers, he hauled and stopped him and said, no, I don't want to sell it. And his brother and him come to the agreement. They said they would sell the house, the plot the house sat on, and the small patch, I think it was 2.5, 3 acres of pasture around it, and lease out the rest of the farm. Well, his wife was from down here locally from Bland County, and her parents had passed away. And they had agreed to do that. Well, they sold the house, and him and his brother had split the proceeds. Just so happened the people that bought the house were into raising livestock and stuff, too. And he said he warned them about it, and evidently it didn't scare him. He don't know what's happened since then. This has been a while back. So he come on down here to Virginia, later on down here in Southwest Virginia. He went around flea markets trying to make extra money because he said, without that money from the farm, him living on Social Security, living income, fixed, it was hard to get by. I know that, and I'm sure you do yourself, Jeffrey. And he told me the story, and he said to this day, he said he would not move up there again if he had to. But that's the reason he moved out here to Virginia. He said they are real. He said for anybody that don't believe it, he said you will experience it if you don't believe, and if you ever do experience it, you can never remove the sight and experiences from your mind. He would not move up there for nothing, that he wouldn't go back. Though his roots, he told me, of 57 years were still up there, and he misses it to this day, but he wouldn't go back for $1 million. He said he's seen it, he's lived it, he's experienced it, and he don't want no more of it.
Right.
And he said down here, he's starting to hear the talk again. But he told me, he said, son, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do now. I ain't got enough money to buy an island off the coast. And he just laughed, and I thanked him for his stories and what he told me, and have a good day, and we went from there and parted ways.
When you were sharing that, I was thinking, those things must have been watching him for a while, him and his brother, to know where the on and off switch was for that electric fence thing. Because
exactly.
And that just shows that these creatures are not stupid in any sense of the word. I mean, to figure it out, to say, hey, we can't get in there, but we can if this part is gone, and then, took care of business. That's insanity. That's wow.
You're exactly right, Jeff. And, to say an alpha predator like that is intelligent as what it is, and is motivated by the hate for human and hunger itself, these things are capable of anything.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I want to thank you for you agreeing to be on tonight. I really appreciate it. And, like we've talked, but when you shared that encounter with me, I was like, wow, I didn't want to tell it. I wanted you to tell it because it was just, it shows how smart they are and how cunning and dangerous they are. From twisting the doorknob, look what happened to poor Luke in Mississippi. It was in his home. So it's, wow. And evidently they knew that this guy had some firearms. Maybe that's what deterred them. And like you said, this guy was not small. He was a big guy. And for him to board up and be upstairs, that was something. It must have really scared him, real good for a big fellow like that to be, put in a predicament that way, backed up against a corner and not knowing what the hell to do, but having to sell, and that's sad. That is sad.
It is. It really is.
So, well, Jay, I want to let you know that I appreciate it, and thank you so much. Would you like to say goodbye to everybody?
Yeah, I'd like to say goodbye to everybody and have a great night. And just to say one thing, fans, people, believers, skeptics, non-believers, these things are as real as you and I. And the bad part about it is they might be smarter than some of us. So keep an eye over your back and
Ain't that the truth, brother? Have a good night.